Hi, everybody. My name's Sean McDonald. I'm the content director here at BoardPro. We're having another Q&A session with our team, which answers the questions that came from the webinar we had last week. So without further ado, let's kick off. I'm going to go for question one, which is for Julie Garland McClellan. And this question is from, let me have a look, it's from Jane. What is a public officer and how does the responsibility differ from that of a company secretary? Julie.
Okay, in Australia, a company secretary is a company officer. We sometimes use the term public officer. Small companies must have at least one public officer, and that's the person whose name is on public record. That's the person who will be held to account for the acts of the company. If you have a registered company secretary, there are certain things that company secretary will be held to account for if the company has not done them. If you don't have a company secretary, then the directors will be held to account for those things if the company has not done them. So really important to think through. A company secretary is a company officer. They have duties, they have a standard of care that is expected of them that is laid down in law. There is a subtle difference between a company secretary and a board secretary. And it's quite important because board secretaries are not usually company officers. They don't have the ability to make decisions that impact the company. And I think really it's important. Don't think so much about public officer. Think about officer of the company. And all directors and all company secretaries should be officers of the company and act accordingly.
Thanks, Julie. The next question. Some believe the use of a minute taker is unnecessary when electronic resources are available. That's from Aaron. Danica, would you like to try and get a hold of that one?
Yeah, I think that belief is quite a dangerous one because you can't do away with human oversight. There is definitely a space for digital minute-taking tools to enhance minute taker, but you always need a human laying over that oversight and judgment. And it's even better to have a human actually doing the minute taking because you can't take away from that human judgment. The humans need to be able to adequately summarize, interpret, and capture the intent and the tone of the meetings, which some of those digital tools don't pick up on. So some board meetings can be very nuanced, and if a tool is just summarizing a transcription, which is what I think a lot of the software does, it actually can't infer the context from a lot of the tone and the body language that you as a board secretary or a company secretary can pick up on by being in the room. That being said, so long as you've got the right security protocols in place and you've done your due diligence, it can be a helpful tool to give you a starter for 10 in those summaries. But you do need to apply that human judgment in the overall summary that's going into the board minutes. You also, as a human, know how to use your discretion when it's necessary, which the technologies don't understand. And you also need to understand that minutes are a legal record of the company's history. And so if you don't have a board secretary or a human minute taker, you are running a risk that those recordings and transcriptions are discoverable and they can be used in court as the official record of those meetings, which can impact a director's ability to have free and frank conversations and create those generative conversations that are important in good governance.
Thanks, Danica. Now, this one's coming back to you again, Julie. Extension of the other question we had. Does a small NFP need either a company secretary or public officer in Australia? It's from Phil.
Hi, Phil. You definitely need a public officer. You cannot create a company without at least one public officer who's going to carry the can if things go wrong. And that's usually the founder in the first instance. You don't need a company secretary unless you are a public company. So you need to think through, do I need one? Am I big enough to be a public company? Am I aspiring to become big enough to be a public company? Because it's always a good idea to build your foundations so that they hold your structure. Then the other thing to think around is, what would I benefit from if I moved from having a person who helped with the board administration, which is what I would call a board secretary, to a qualified company secretary who might be able to provide additional help with things like understanding some of the legislative requirements, understanding the lodgement timetable, and also understanding what makes good boards good, and therefore how to help this board step up to that standard.
Okay, so this is a question from Talaso. I hope I got that pronunciation correct. How do you address minuting confidential strategic discussions and in-camera sessions in board meetings?
Minuting in-camera sessions, particularly if you are talking about things like your company secretary's remuneration and you don't want your company secretary in the room taking the notes of that discussion, there are two things that I have seen boards do very well. One is the chair makes a couple of notes. They are not minutes, they are notes. But at the beginning of the board meeting, the chair reads into the minutes of the board meeting that the board had a discussion, and during that discussion they made the following decisions, and now those things are in the official record. So that's one way to do it. And another way to do it is for the chair to turn their personal notes into an official record, which gets given to the company secretary and loaded up on the portal alongside the official minutes, as this is a record of the meeting. My advice is always make these things records and notes. Courts will accept contemporaneous notes, but don't call them minutes, because you don't want somebody who is supposed to be part of the discussion, especially when it's the chair who's a major factor in the discussion's success. You don't want that person not being able to take part.
Thanks, Julie. So next question is from Talaso. How do you address minuting confidential strategic discussions and in-camera sessions in board meetings? Danica, would you like to tackle that one?
Yeah, it really depends. If it's a confidential conversation and the company secretary is asked to leave the room, which is most common in committee time, in camera time, directors only time, as it's sometimes heard, then it's up to the chair, I believe, to either not minute it if it's going to be very confidential, frank discussion, and to just simply put in the minutes that the board went into directors only time, or to have a very brief summary of the conversation, which they can send to the company secretary to incorporate into the minutes, or have it as a separate set of in-committee minutes, which would be approved at the next in-committee session at the board meeting and would remain confidential in any sort of due diligence process, but is still discoverable if it went to court. So should still be a high-level summary of what those discussions were. And then in some instances, the company secretary will remain in the meeting, and then it's their duty to just provide a very summarized high-level summary of what that discussion was. And it would just be a very general overview of what was discussed and any key actions or decisions that were made.
Thanks, Danica. Next question. Should the duties of the secretary be defined in a document such as a board charter? That's from Megan. Jen, would you like to tackle that one?
Yeah, I sure would, Sean. Absolutely. And I'm all for your board charter, including everybody on the board. And although the board secretary or the company secretary isn't a board member, a director, or a trustee in their own right, they are a member of the board and they are valued. So in your board charter, you should have a list of the annual work plan that the board is going to be tackling, and also the duties and responsibilities of the company secretary or the board secretary, including that every director, trustee, or board member has access to that person to have free conversations with them, and what the responsibilities, the key performance indicators, and the expectations of the board should be, including how the board secretary behaves in the meeting and the obligations to the chair and the CE, because it's an important bridge that the board secretary or the company secretary performs with that bridge between the CE and the chair. So those should all be included in your board charter or your code of conduct or your rules to live by, as some of the boards will put it.
Thanks, Jen. Next question. Are minute takers allowed to speak during a meeting? And if so, what are the criteria for this? Now, I'm going to pass this question from Hank to Julie.
Hi. I think if you trust somebody enough to allow them to take the minutes of your board meeting, you should trust them enough to allow them to open their mouths when they need to. And usually if a board minute taker is trying to keep track of a discussion that's gone backwards and forwards, and they get to the end of it and they're thinking, I don't know what we decided, I'm perfectly happy for that person to say, excuse me, could we just clarify the resolution for the minutes? And most boards would much rather stop and spend a minute of their precious board time rather than have every single director toing and froing by email afterwards because they weren't happy with what was in the minutes. That's one instance. Another instance is when very often your minute taker or your company secretary is also running the list of who's supposed to be coming in and out of the boardroom to present and talk to papers. So they might well interrupt and say, excuse me, Mr. Chair, but the Solicitor General's here. Shall we adjourn this discussion and keep to that person's schedule because she's really important? And then when we get to the end of her session with us, we can resume and I'll be able to tell you where we were. They won't need to say that last bit. You'll just know that they'll be able to tell you, right, this is where we've got to in the discussion. So those sorts of interjections I'm quite happy with when they are reporting on company secretarial matters and the progress thereof. So often during the matters arising, they will have something to say, but what they should not do is take part in board decisions. They might give information to the board about the limits of their power or the way they exercise it, but they don't take part in the decision. And when they do, they very often get into trouble.
Thanks, Julie.
Can I just
This next question.
Can I just chime in there, Julie? Because Danica and I are in very unique positions in that we are professional board secretaries and we work across many different industries and different boards. So quite often the board, I don't know if Danica has experienced this, but I certainly do, in that quite often my boards will say, Jen, have you got any insight? What's happening in your other boards? How do your other boards manage that? And so we're not in the 1950s anymore. We are actually valuing our board secretaries for the information and the knowledge that they have and that they can bring. And it means that those board members don't actually have to have all of that industry knowledge, all of that governance knowledge, all of the knowledge about their shareholders' agreements and their delegations of authorities, etc., because they can rely on the company secretary to speak up when necessary about those things, and they've got value to add.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Jen.
Everyone who's got an invitation to speak has the right to speak. Can't ask them a question and then expect them not to answer and say, oh, sorry, I'm not going to tell you the answer because we're in a board meeting and I don't speak at board meetings.
Pretty. Yes, you know, I care as if you're a little bit. I can be sitting in the kind of meeting when you're not allowed to speak, then you're not going to get people like Jen.
No,
Certainly not.
you'll get people who aren't as good. And that's the thing. You want your company. I often ask company secretaries when we're doing something, have you ever seen a board do this quickly and easily? Because sometimes they have, but they're just politely watching us go round in circles. And yeah, if you don't trust your company secretary's judgment, get a different company secretary and give the one you've got training and support so they develop that judgment in the future.
Thanks, team. Next question is from, let me have a look, from Mariam. And she asks, can a board member request to see the minutes before they are tabled at the next meeting? Jen, would you like to tackle that one?
Yes, and the answer is short and sweet, Sean. The board members should have the minutes out to review from the board meeting within 5 days. So I turn my minutes around within 24 to 48 hours to the chair of the board, and then I expect the chair of the board to quickly review those. And I often have agreements with my very busy chairs that if they haven't had a chance to review them within that 5-day period, that I will be sending the draft minutes out to the board for their input, noting that the chair has not had an opportunity to look at those. So can a board member ask? Absolutely, but they should always expect those minutes to be out within that 5-day time frame for them to review.
Thanks, Jen. I think I'm going to pass this next question to you as well, actually. This is from Georgia. I am the CEO of an NGO. My executive assistant needs to serve as our board secretary. What would be an appropriate level of training for her? We don't need to be at full company secretary level.
Sure. Look, I'm just going to push my own barrow here because at the current point, I am developing with BoardPro a masterclass called How to Be the Best Board Secretary You Can Be. And that won't be too far away. I think that would be absolutely perfect training for your EA and really great to upskill and be able to provide that background and information that they need to be the best board secretary that they can be.
Thanks, Jen. This one is from Axon. I think I pronounced that correctly, Axon. If you're an unqualified company secretary with 18 plus years experience, where can you find a mentor to bounce ideas off? Danica, would you like to have a crack at that one?
Yeah, I think a good place to start is governance bodies. Here in New Zealand is the Institute of Directors or Governance New Zealand, to just attend some of their events and see who you might meet there. Looking on LinkedIn, proactively seeking out company secretaries and just reaching out to them and asking if they're able to connect and just share a few words with you, explain that you're an experienced company secretary and you're just looking for a peer network. You can also reach out to your current contacts in terms of the chair and directors on your board, because they might know other company secretaries from other boards that they sit on and be happy to introduce you, and you can start a conversation there. Or you could actually just start your own little peer group or network by reaching out to a number of those different people and finding out whether they are actually interested in doing kind of a peer-to-peer mentoring type situation, because I think you'll find that most of them work in their silos, which can be quite lonely, and are very keen to connect with like-minded individuals in similar situations as them.
Great piece of advice. Thanks, Danica. Our final question of the session today is from Tyler. And Tyler asks, do you think having a governance executive is a good idea, or is it more useful to have the company secretary separate from the executive team, acting as a conduit between the executive and the board? Julie, I'm going to hand that to you.
Okay, I think the short answer is it depends, but some ideas to think about to help you make that decision. One, does the person that you have as your putative company secretary have the skills, have the personal characteristics that enable them to be able to be a trusted advisor to the board and also a valued member of the executive team, without those two different roles contaminating each other? Some of the knowledge from each role is useful, and the secretary can be a great conduit between the board and management, but some of it is highly dangerous. And the secretary needs to be a person with enough personal strength of character and integrity to be able to handle having information that they cannot share with groups of which they are a valued member. So it's really important. I sometimes refer to this as maturity, but I have seen this maturity in 18-year-olds, and I have failed to find it in 65-year-olds. it really is a question for you as a board. Do I know this person? Is this person capable of these two roles? And the other thing is, have I given this person the training and support, the access to another professional secretary, perhaps to help them in the early stages so that they are capable and confident rather than just capable but scared stiff? Training and support are so important, and that's why I love what we do here.
Thanks, Julie. So, Danica, I think you've got an interesting perspective on that. Do you want to jump in and just comment there?
Yeah, I think I've been both an executive assistant to a CEO, which involved the board secretary function, and am obviously now a independent board secretary and company secretary. And I think there's value in both models. But the issue is when you are an executive that supports the leadership team and you are supporting the board, you can become quite compromised in that position because it's hard to be independent and keep that confidentiality, because you'll often have members of the executive team wanting to find out what the outcomes were of those board meetings, what the deeper kind of conversation was that's not necessarily in the board minutes. So having an independent company secretary or an independent professional board secretary that comes in and does these meetings does keep that process independent, and they are a conduit between management and the board, and they don't get involved in the day-to-day operations of the company. So they can be completely independent and don't become quite so compromised in that confidentiality.
Brilliant. Thanks for that perspective, Danica. So that brings us to the end of our session, team. Thank you very much for your comments and answers. We will endeavour to host these Q&A sessions at the end of every webinar, everybody. When we have time on our webinars, which we generally do, because they're only 45 minutes long, we host these Q&A sessions as a follow-up. So thanks again, everybody. We'll see you next time.